Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, The Digital Transformation of Advocacy and Lobbying. My name is Chelsea Robb. I'm the Managing Director of Enterprise Solutions for FiscalNote. For those of you who are a bit unfamiliar with FiscalNote, we are a technology company at the forefront of helping organizations bring on digital tools to support their government affairs, public affairs, advocacy, and lobbying work. We aggregate legislative and regulatory information from around the world, have an award-winning newsroom covering everything that's happening on Capitol Hill. And alongside of that, we have tools to support issues management, stakeholder management, and grassroots advocacy. From in-depth analysis to what is happening in the EU institutions to local monitoring of counties in the US, we are an all-in-one solution for everything digital public affairs. So with that, I've got just a few quick housekeeping items to cover before we get started. You'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can use that to submit questions throughout the webinar. Please submit your questions at any time and we'll attempt to get to as many of those as possible during our time together. This session is also being recorded, so afterwards you're going to be sent a copy of this event. Everyone should have joined and have been muted upon entry, but if you're not, with the exception of our panelists and for the benefit of the audience, please ensure that your microphone is muted. I'm really excited today because I'm joined by 4 industry experts who are coming to us from 4 separate locations. So, please excuse the variations in sound quality and perhaps slight pauses, but we're really excited to talk to you today. So first up, I would love for today's panelists to introduce themselves. To make it easier in this remote environment, let's do this alphabetically. So we'll start with Alan. Alan, take it away.
All right, yes, thank you, Chelsea, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Alan Hardacre. I'm the Director of Group Corporate Affairs for Imperial Brands, managing a team of directly around 30 people and indirectly a function of about 180 people around the world. So I'll share with you some of my insights around the world of digital transformation and public affairs in the coming hour.
Let's go, John, to you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. I'm John Pornor. I am the head of 3M's Government Affairs Center of Excellence. We are a think tank within 3M. Our operations are in 70+ countries, and we of course communicate to governments of those countries through our teams on the ground. And I work with them very closely in developing their local, national, and regional strategies. Happy to be here.
Thanks, John. Marcel?
Hi, Chelsea. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Marcel Halma. I'm Vice President for Government Affairs at Nouryon. Nouryon is a global company, global chemicals company based in Amsterdam in Europe. And we're working in 5 continents. We have about 80 countries that we serve, and most of our products are in global markets. So we are a truly global company. I have a very small team as government affairs. We work a lot with people in the business, with country managers who act as our advocates around the world. So it's a very interdisciplinary team.
Thanks, Marcel. Last, certainly not least, Molly.
Thanks, Chelsea. Hello, everyone. I am Molly Guthrie. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for Susan G. Komen, which is the world's leading breast cancer organization, working to end breast cancer forever and supporting patients both in the US and worldwide. In my role, I oversee our public policy and advocacy efforts both in Washington, D.C., but in state capitals across the US.
Thanks, Molly. Do you want to introduce Cooper behind you as well? No. We've got another panel.
My coworkers are here with me today.
Well, thanks, everyone. We're really excited. So to kick things off, Marcel, I'd like to start with you. I know I feel like I'm constantly asking you about this topic, but it's super interesting to me, and I think hopefully it will be really interesting to a lot of our attendees today. I'd love for you to share a little bit about your general philosophy towards advocacy, and also, when you look to influence, I know it's really impacted how you have built out your team. So really your general philosophy and the timing of when you look to influence different individuals and stakeholders.
Thanks. Yeah, happy to do that, Chelsea, to kick off this discussion, giving our general approach. I think what differs us from many other people working in government affairs is that we're not so much policy-based, but we were really working issue-based, both risk and opportunities. And there, I always try to take a proactive approach. One of the standard instructions in my group, in our company, is to avoid politics as much as possible. Why? Because we want to influence and shape policy when it is being made. So for instance, I'm rather with the legislators or decision makers, or like here in Europe, people working in ministries who are developing legislation and regulation, than waiting until it all comes out and then you have to fight into the big political arena. That's a different mindset. I think to many, I know that many work basically focused on the political scene and interacting there. The reason why we have taken this approach is that the influence at the beginning when an issue is shaping, and that can be because government is thinking about it, or think tanks mention it, or even NGOs start raising it. And so we also look very much at data in public opinion. But if you are at the beginning of the stage, you find also decision makers who are still very open, because for them it's a new issue as well. They need input. They want to know how things are impacted positively, negatively, what kind of contribution you can bring. Well, your costs are relatively low. If you go out in the field there when the big decisions are already made, and the last commas have to be changed, then obviously the cost is much higher, also in terms of already starting to implement things, while your influence is pretty low. And my experience is also that in that way you have a different discussion with your own business. If you come to them with something that is new, which is going to happen, you can still have the time to do a risk assessment, or even see if there are opportunities which you can jump on as a business, but it gives them time to think along with you, instead of that you are only bringing them the bad news that something is going to change and they have to change with that. What I also see in our world that we're working on, that there is a lot of new legislation and regulation coming, and I guess in the coming years it will be even more, both here in Europe with a huge and ambitious European Commission with a huge legislative program, but also in the US, I see a major shift. And the more that the Trump administration is deregulating, the more we see legislation and regulations coming up in the different states, which makes the field to play even more difficult. And I think even the COVID crisis, particularly in the US, has empowered the states even more in following that track and setting up their own legislation. That also means for us, I think the big challenge we're all facing here in the panel, but also in the audience, is how to keep this organized, because the inflow of information is massive, but how to make sure that we focus on the right things. And I think going forward, working the old-fashioned way with Excel sheets and SharePoints, etc., is not sufficient anymore. What we have been looking for, also because we're a 24/7 company, is tools that help us both in combining political intelligence, in having the stakeholders together there, in getting the data right to make good assessments both on feasibility as well as on data, as on impact on our company, on the issues we have, but also to have a workplace, because many of our issues are global and play in different regions at the same time. It's also important that over the different time zones in the world, we have one place where we can have the same instructions for the teams, whether it's the key messages or whether it's objectives, and even if something changes in a certain regions, that the other teams are aware of that. And I mean, that is, I think, crucial going forward. This is a seminar about digital transformation. I think we are now at the edge of moving forward in terms of that we have to define being accountable as a function, but also have to sort out that we, with limited resources, can still service our businesses as good as well. That goes for a global multinational profit-making company. I think it goes as well for an NGO or a non-profit organization, also to make sure that you stay right on top of your issues and make sure that you deliver to your members or your clients. And that is, I think that's a challenge for all of us. But yeah, to stay ahead of that game, my approach, Chelsea, to finish my introduction, is that we try to stay ahead of the game and not so much follow the political discussion, but try to be ahead of the curve. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. I have asked Marcel this question so many times, and I'm constantly kind of impressed and learn new things every time he answers it. So we'll talk a little bit more later on in the panel about what you were saying in terms of like metrics and how you're reporting back to the business, internal and external. But Alan, I want to kick it to you. For those of you who are unaware in the audience, Alan undersold himself quite a bit in his introduction. He just published a book specifically around public affairs in the EU and how, you know, the digitization of corporate and public affairs is evolving. So for anyone in the audience who has oversight over the EU, I can't recommend the book enough. So Alan, I'm curious, I know, you know, you've been in the public affairs space for a long time, and you've been particularly interested in how public affairs has evolved. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about what this digital transformation of corporate affairs has looked like for you. And also, you know, where do you see this going, you know, in the next couple of years here?
Yes, okay. Thank you for the book plug, Chelsea. Much appreciated. I'm British, therefore I'm far too modest, and I wouldn't dare do that myself. I'll now try to answer your question, and I think basically I'm effectively picking up the ball from where Marcel left off in many ways, because obviously the digital transformation journey has been going on for some time in the public affairs world, and I think all of us on the panel, all of us probably in the audience, have been working out how we interface with that digital journey. And I mean that from what engagement tools do we use, how do we do our monitoring. Every aspect of what we do could have and has increasingly got digital components to it. So, and I think it broadly feeds into an agenda now, and that's certainly the way that I come to see this, of how does the digital world allow me as a leader, but also as an individual, how does it allow me to do more with less? How does it make my life easier? How does it take tasks away from me and my broader team to make life easier? And there I would make 5 points. And I know that John is going to pick up on a few of these afterwards, so hopefully I'm setting you up nicely for that, John. So the 5 things I would say is, and Marcel picked up on the first one. The first one is about information management. So going forward, I think we, all of us, you know, and this is whether there's just one person running an organization or whether you're a team of 500, I think information becomes vitally important, because there are so many different platforms, sources of information, there's so many things happening, they're happening so quickly. How do you possibly take all of that and make it meaningful and in one place? And I think that's a real challenge, and one that we need to land. And I think that's about information coming in. It's also about having an ability to store your own information. What meetings did I have? What was said? What are my documents? What are my positions? Nothing seems to capture all of this effectively, and that's very important. From the information management, and obviously this one sort of feeds the other, then you move into information analytics. And that's an ability to have some AI overlay to visualize things for you, to pull trends, to pull data. I think that also is something that can be very important going forward, that also will give you added value and free up some time and space. Which moves again, sort of by increment here, you go towards, I think, more predictive digital. So trying to predict voting patterns, to predict trends, to move into a space where it's helping you not just determine what happened yesterday and where things are today, but perhaps where they might be tomorrow. And again, I don't think necessarily as a public affairs professional, I'm looking for something that's 100% right. That'd be quite worrying. We might start to worry for our jobs if that's the case. I think it's more a tool that's going to allow me to focus my energy in a much sharper way going forwards, who, where, and what. So it's just about being more targeted. And that feeds into, and I think this is then where John's going to come in a second, is the world of big data, because then I think by increment you move into a world of what we in our company, the power business intelligence world, and how do we as government relations, public affairs professionals plug into what effectively the rest of our business is doing in this space. And I just give you one example from my company. You know, we have so much marketing data and focus groups and consumer data that I'm quite sure that if we, from a government relations perspective, were allowed to operate and mine that effectively, could come up with some great messaging insights. At the moment, we don't quite have the interface and the tools, but why not aspire to this in the future? So it's tapping into the data that exists. And then finally, is my last point, Chelsea, and I think I would be remiss if I didn't say this, and the digital has to get better at helping us as public affairs professionals articulate our return on investment, articulate our contribution to our members, to our companies, and I think digital can really help us in that space in sort of identifying, what are the issues we manage, how do we do it, what's the benefit to the company. So yeah, so lots of different areas. I sort of put them in sort of incremental order there, and yeah, as I say, I suspect other panelists will pick up from some of those in a second.
Yeah, no, thank you, Alan. And just so the panel or the attendees are aware, I've seen some hands being raised and some questions come through. We're going to hold questions and kind of Q&A till about 20 minutes till the hour. So I promise I'm not ignoring you. We'll get to you in just a few minutes here. But yeah, Alan, I mean, I think you brought up a lot of good points, piggybacking on kind of Marcel's point about ROI and documentation and reporting. And then, it's a nice segue to a question that I had for John on really like big data. So as everyone can imagine, of course, 3M's really been on the front lines of supporting the world's response to COVID. And John, I think, has had more of a front row seat than anybody here, being in a role where he works with many of the global functions within the company. So I'm curious, John, from your perspective, what are the long-lasting public affairs trends that we're going to see coming out of COVID? And also, to tie it back to big data, how has COVID impacted the need for that within public affairs and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I would couch that as several different steps that we used to take in normal government affairs speeds, but when geopolitical events rapidly and dynamically change the environment, the need and speed with which we have to collect data and process it becomes incredibly important. When you have a natural legislative process, for instance, that you're tracking, and it moves through the various institutions with a certain speed, your speed of data collection has to match at a minimum the speed with which the legislative or political process is moving. But I think COVID-19 was a pressure test of the system in a way, because multiple countries were making important decisions about themselves and their citizens, and they were all moving at the same time. Information was being decided and then acted upon at a cycle faster than what you would normally see. So for us, the first thing when you have so much data coming at you in such a short period of time was really to understand what is happening. So the descriptive nature of the data, we have to be comprehensive, we have to be accurate, data is live, and so effective collection becomes a critical factor, and we had to do that probably more aggressively than we have ever done it before. We had to understand why it was happening. So all that data that is getting collected now in large volumes over a compressed period of time, we had to drill down and see what the root causes are. What can we do? We have a great degree of transparency, integrity, utmost respect for what the governments are going through, and empathy with the challenges they're facing. How can we be of service in the most meaningful way? Knowing, rooted in the factors that are actually influencing the decisions that are being made at the government level. Now, what is happening can give an indication of what the near and distant future actions may look like. So there's a predictive component to this, of course, that Alan also referred to, and that is what is likely to happen. Where are governments heading to? Can we develop an intercept path to be able to meet them there, be of service to them as we work with them on a number of issues that they have? So those strategies require that we not only collect the data, but have the, I would say, cultural and political literacy required to understand which direction nations are going, why they're making those decisions, and how to be effective in responding to that. And of course, Finally, all of that data could be processed to be prescriptive, to offer proposals, things that necessarily at a government level, it may not be well understood, but as a manufacturer, a producer, a supplier, we may have insights into how to work things more effectively, and we can bring those forward for the public good and be able to share those with government. So all of that for us required basically having a higher bandwidth for data, and then a higher bandwidth for processing that data into actionable outcomes.
That's great. No, I think, excuse me, I think that, you know, a lot of what the three of you had just said kind of marries together quite nicely, and is a good segue to kind of the back half of our conversation today, in terms of, like, you know, what is the ROI that you're sharing? What type of reports can you be generating? How are you really using the data to impact your strategy? Before we go into more of the tactical elements, I am curious, Molly, from your perspective. I mean, we've talked about COVID, so now I feel like the next obvious topic for discussion has to be the U.S. election. So I would be remiss if I didn't touch on that before we moved on. But you know, Molly, obviously, of course, this is on the minds of a lot of our clients and, you know, people in the industry and people on the line today. But, you know, how people are going to best manage kind of new stakeholders that are going to arise out of you know, November 3rd, really no matter what happens at both the state and federal level. I know earlier this year, you really had to kind of like pivot and transition your fly-in to be digital, and move, you know, 150 people or so from Capitol Hill to online. So I really would like to hear a little bit more about, like, how you think about ensuring that you have a sustainable corporate affairs strategy and messaging going into 21, and how you've leveraged events like the fly-in to really make that possible, and continue to do so going into next year.
Yes. So you know, I think similar to everyone else, 2020 has made it interesting for government affairs, especially in the US, looking at what we're doing in DC, but also in states, because a lot of that work grinded to a halt once COVID started. So we have kind of had to figure out a new world that we did not have to use before, which is this virtual setting. A lot of patient advocacy work is really rooted in that community, and advocates being able to share their stories and their voices with legislators and their staff. And, you know, as obviously as a result of COVID, that was not able to happen in person. So, you know, Chelsea, as you mentioned, in September, we held our first ever virtual fly-in for our federally focused work, which was an interesting change, but was actually kind of beneficial for the population that we represent. So when you think of people that are in active treatment, or might be a recent survivor, the idea of them being able to travel to Washington, D.C., or be on an airplane, and being exposed to everything that's out there with or without COVID, can be a huge undertaking. And so one silver lining of going to a virtual event is that we were able to actually involve more patients and a wider population than we've been able to do in our in-person event in DC, which I think resulted in more impactful and meaningful meetings, as what we heard back from all of our constituents. Additionally, I think when we think of our traditional fly-ins, you know, staffers are going from a 15-minute meeting to a 15-minute meeting to a 15-minute meeting, right? They have crazy schedules, and it has continued. But as part of the virtual setting, we shared a lot of our materials beforehand. And so as a result, what we heard back in our meeting feedback was that the meetings were more meaty and more meaningful. The staffers and the elected officials came to the meetings with specific questions, and we were able to see, you know, direct results from those meetings. And so, you know, we are anticipating replicating this again in the spring, and doing a virtual setting again for our our DC-based buy-in, but also right now looking to see how we replicate this at the state level. Again, knowing that each state will be different. Some of them are set up for, virtual committee hearings, and some of them by their state rules are prohibited from doing virtual committee hearings and stuff in the virtual setting. So how do you balance all of those things out, but still ensure that our priorities and our patient voices are heard? On the election side, I think any election year is tough to predict what the impact is going to be. I think the expectation across local, state, and federal levels is that there's going to be turnover and change and new people in seats, and people that are carryover as well. And so our strategy right now is really engaging as many of our constituents as we can. I think in 2020, people that might not be like the five of us and be very engaged and excited about policy and advocacy, more and more people have seen the impact that governmental decisions can have on their lives. And as a result, we've seen an increase in interest in people that want to be involved. And so we're focused now on really bolstering and building up the constituents and advocates that we have. So regardless of the outcomes of these elections, that we'll have people that we can, activate and continue to build those relationships with legislators.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to something I've been curious about, and I would pose this to all of our panelists. Not only what role does stakeholder management kind of like play in managing the policy and reputational risks that your organization's facing, but further to Molly's point just now, how are you building any new stakeholder relationships or networks in a mostly remote work environment? How have you kind of seen that play out across your organization?
So, I'll answer quickly for Komen. This was something that had been, I guess, kind of in the back of our minds for a couple of years now. And with COVID, took the opportunity to implement it. And so we are launching kind of an online learning management system for our advocates, that it is in a virtual setting. Trainings are available on a virtual platform, so it's on demand. It's not an expectation that stakeholders or patients come to a training, but they can do this on their own time, and really strategizing where and who those people are. So right now we're doing this at the congressional district level to try to build out someone that we have an advocacy champion in every congressional district that has gone through this training system. But eventually, drilling all the way down to finding those stakeholders at the state Senate districts or the state House districts. Again, the importance of stakeholder management and those local connections with legislators.
Yeah, I can certainly comment on what we do. I think in this environment, the more focused and connected we are to the issues that are, I would say, central to the individuals we're trying to reach, the easier it is for us to get a bit of their time and be able to communicate. Quite often in the past, I think that level of communication really revolved around a lot of oral content that we would exchange. We are really making a concerted effort to have briefings, short white papers, etc., that really amplifies what we want to say. And we customize that content down to the individual country, region within the country, etc., because we realize public value may have different interpretations in different places, and we need to be extremely sensitive to what those individuals representing their constituents find as publicly valuable. And so we want to make sure we connect all the dots, don't leave anything to interpretation, and are as clear, as direct, and as practical, and as connected to the issues they're facing. So for us, it is actually writing what we would have shared through a conversation to be more definitive, and in the kind of digital interactions that we have, it's something we can leave behind so they can review that and then read that, discuss that, share that, and be able to get back to us. So for us, that is a major change compared to what we did before.
And John, do you feel like, having more than 50 operations in 50 plus countries across the globe, are you having to prioritize those issues that you're creating these white papers for? And if so, how?
Ironically, I would say governments, when it comes to need, have far more in common with one another than in difference. All countries are needing and seeking better healthcare systems, better infrastructure. They want to have better emergency preparedness and response systems activated. And they learn lessons as they go through the various events that befall them during the course of their history, and that institutional memory in those governments sort of colors the kind of decisions and policies they eventually make. So what we found out is that when we, let's say, advocate a particular issue having to do with healthcare, that in many countries that underlying need is still there. With the varying degree of intensity. So the messages that we create, we find variations of it are still very impactful in the different countries, and we use them, we draw upon them to create those customized communication pieces by country, by region, by district, by constituency, to make sure we're effective. But we don't feel like we're developing 50 radically different approaches to what we're proposing, let's say, on a healthcare issue. We have the common theme is there, and we just need to make sure we connect it to what is important and current in that particular country.
Yeah, and bringing it back to, like connecting it, showing what's important, it reminded me kind of about some of the ROI conversations that we were talking about at the front end of this. So, I pose this question to all panelists, but specifically Marcel and Alan, so I know you talked a little bit about this. How are you demonstrating your ROI right now back to the business? Alan, you talked about how digital's got to get back to that, especially in this environment. I question, like, well, how are you doing it, and what recommendations do you have for the audience to do so too?
On ROI, Chelsea, I think that's something that we dedicate a lot of energy to, and increasingly so over the last few years. And basically how we do that is we have a document that we pull together every quarter in line with our internal business planning process. And basically what we do is we look to capture a certain number of pieces of information. So we want to know what the issue is that is being faced. We want to know the likelihood of it happening. So that's a bit of a local sense check, effectively. We want to know the timing, and if there is a timeline. So it's likely to happen in Q2, or there are some milestones along the way. And then we want to know what the annualized financial impact is, whether it's recurring or one-off, so that we can get a bit of scale to the situation. We also want to know whether this is something that is industry or whether it is company. Is this something that's hitting everybody, or is it even more general than just in industry? And where does the financial impact land? Is it disproportionately on us, or is it on others? So we and as you can imagine, if you then slice and dice that allows us to take a view of what the biggest issues are, what the most pressing issues are, issues where our colleagues think that we have opportunity for success. Just because it's the biggest issue, if the local team have said there's zero probability of influence, then it becomes more of a can manage it to compliance than it does from an engagement perspective. And we turn all of this into numbers. It's not an exact science, but I have to say that that was actually a very smooth process until COVID. It became very difficult for us to quantify. How do you quantify keeping a factory it became very difficult. We just ended up with two words, which was business critical, because we couldn't find another way to articulate the value. And I think that's something that we still need to work on. So I'm interested on how Marcel does it.
Thank you. Well, here are some lessons, Alan. Now, building on your building on your answer, which I fully agree with, I think in terms of ROI, what I have discovered over the years is that predictability is crucial with your company management. And indeed, some things can be monetized. You can put a euro or a dollar value on it, but we've also seen that sometimes goodwill can be a very good return for the company. My company, previous company, AkzoNobel, has been under a big takeover effort from a competitor. We managed to shield it off. As a result, our company was split. But at that time, there was, what is the money value? You can say that's the total value of our company. But what we also managed is that the goodwill that we created as government affairs function was so huge that we even the years after benefited from it. The predictability, I would say, is one. Make sure that your company leadership, your business leaders or your functional leaders understand what is going to happen and what you can do about it. That is why we also start at the very early stage to have that discussion with the business and discuss the business impact, make an assessment with them. And on the basis of that, we make a very simple action plan. I don't like action plans or strategies which are 20 pages, because you keep on updating them. I rather have it on 1 or 2 pages and that's it. But what I've learned over the years is the critical thing is usually many people in your company or in your organization are very good in the problem, setting the problem and doing the analysis why it went wrong or why it is a challenge for us or why it is an opportunity. But for me, critical to start working on an issue is there a clear objective? And that objective is very important in terms of defining your ROI. What I see too many times, too often, is that the objective is still clear, but that they already want you to run with it. And then if you don't have a clear objective, what you want to achieve, then it also at some point becomes very difficult to explain then what your added value was, what your return on the investment was. And last but not least, I think the way, data reporting for government affairs is a lot different than, for instance, for marketing and sales. But what I do try to report on and use data for is the trend development. Sometimes it is impossible to really fend off an issue, but if you can indeed predict how an issue is developing and use the data in terms of adjusting your strategy, that helps a lot. So what we did in the company is develop a radar, which we have a time dimension. Will it happen this year or in 3 years' time? What is the impact? What is the likelihood, predictability? So it's kind of a three-dimensional topic of a radar model. For me, it's very important, and also in my conversations with the business, if you see that an issue which say is going to happen to you in 2 years' time is moving rapidly forward, and 3 months later is already happening in 1 year time, then apparently there has been some dynamics in that issue which either externally have stepped it up, or there might perhaps be internal reasons. That's one thing. But also if you see that an opportunity is falling back or a risk is getting bigger, there's also a reason to start having that discussion with your business, with your stakeholders, or with your CEO, whether the approach that we are still having is still the right one. And it can well be that it is the right one, or that we have to mitigate our response to it, or just change our objectives to it. I think that is very critical in kind of having these kind of discussions with your business to define at the end of the day your return on investment. Because if you can increase the predictability of what is happening to the issues for your organization, then they start seeing you as an investment instead of a cost. If a return on investment is defined of a return on cost, then I think you ended with your function on the wrong side of the line.
Yeah, and we had a question from one of our attendees that I think hit on a lot of what you just said, Marcel, related to early warning, predictability. it was around, she mentioned that she completely agrees with the comments on the importance of engaging with government and stakeholders on an issue before it hits the public domain. But she finds that this tends to be very relationship driven. And do you see particular ways that digitization can help with this type of pre-issuance discovery of emerging proposals, so that you can be in touch with regulators or your business unit on the topic perhaps before it's crystallized? I'd be curious to get everyone's thoughts on that.
Yeah. Now let me kick that one off then. I very much agree, and already building on what Molly and John just said about stakeholders. If you start building stakeholders and relationships when an issue is happening, you're basically too late. It's a long-term game. And what we're constantly doing about the critical issues that we see emerging is make sure that we have the right stakeholders. And in that sense, digitization is very, very helpful. We are using FiscalNote, not only as government affairs, our communications team is making use of it as well. Some other functions will be introduced to it as well. But already now I can very well map if for certain issues we have the right people or the right level. Sometimes we know the right people, but they're not the right level. Or we know people, for instance, in Shanghai, but they are working in a different division of government than the ones that we think we have to face within a year or a couple of months. So in that sense, digitization helps me in bringing that field together and seeing on the spot where are our gaps in our stakeholder network. That's one thing. The other is, we make a lot of use of very good risk trend analysis which are out there, and there are a lot of free. I think January is always the month which I like very much, when you have the WEF, the World Economic Forum risk report, global risk report. Edelman comes out with its trust barometer. If you really go through them, there are so many leads in it. If you go through all kinds of studies and reports with your businesses also, and have them defined with our kind of the key issues, key stakeholders coming to them, you can already start working. If they flag, we see this coming up, it's not an issue now, but we expect in 2 years we need to do something. That is already when we start building stakeholders. And then having such a digital tool to bring it together helps us in keeping track if we are going in the right way, if we need to step up efforts, if we need to bring different people in to build that stakeholder base, which we at some point indeed in the pre-issuance phase need to really reach out and get on it.
Yeah, I want to maybe pipe in here and give a hybrid answer that covers the last question and this one. I think the ROI and all relates heavily to metrics. Measuring outcomes becomes very important, and outcomes that can be comprehended by the rest of the business organization, to whom we usually provide a very distinct service. We usually put those outcomes in 4 different baskets, because to us they have very different nature, and measuring them may require different levels of skills and different types of measurements. One is legislative and regulatory. So if we are looking for certain outcomes in that area, what are the precursor activities that we have to do at the right frequency, at the right quality, with the right people, at the right depth, with the right thought leadership, to be able to have a voice on that. And so those things all become metrics for that. Another area for us is market access. In many cases, being able to provide our solutions to the market requires us to remove barriers to market access. And so there's a whole host of activities that we tend to measure on that. A third one for us is reputation and our brand with government officials and governments in general. We want to make sure we're seen in the right way, with the kind of values as a company that we bring forward. So reputation and branding and how you amplify that has its own metrics that we use. And I would say finally for us, it's issue management, reactive to events or issues, and the speed with which, the intensity with which we're able to respond creates a set of metrics for us in those areas. For us, frequency of engagement, quality of engagement, level of thought leadership we bring to the issue, and the kind of amplification we get from the discussions we have and the engagements we have become really important. But at the end of the day, we have to look at the kind of outcomes we were seeking and see whether we were able to achieve those outcomes and to what extent. That informs us and allows us to develop maybe new branches to our strategy, decide whether we have done what we can and that is the end of the story, or decide what alternatives we need to go to. So to me, measuring these types of things and being able to report that is a critical part of showing how the ecosystem of how a business or an organization functions, interacts with society, with government, with its customers, with its suppliers. All of these really get compressed into these types of actions and the ways in which we measure them. For us, measurement is becoming increasingly critical, and that means we somehow need to translate soft data into something that has an assigned value to it, and that we report on that value, or a hybrid of metrics that is able to better paint the picture of what government affairs does. I'll let maybe some of the other panelists comment on that as well.
No, John, I think that's a great point, and I really I like how you broke it down into those 4 buckets. And reputation management I think is so important too, especially in like the digital age. And I would argue Susan G. Komen has one of the best ones out there. So Molly, I'd be curious from your perspective, like how should teams think about growing their online presence, and really what do you recommend that they do to get their message out there?
Yes. So from the advocacy and policy space, this was something, it's a great question because it's something that we struggled with a little bit. As you alluded to, we have a pretty large social presence for the organization writ large. But with that also comes some struggles with getting policy and advocacy content out there, because there are, other priorities in addition to our priorities for the organization. And so we actually kind of jumped in head first about a year ago and launched some advocacy and policy specific pages as kind of branch offs from our main social presence pages, which allowed us to have more tailored content and also interact directly with policymakers more frequently. But what we have found is that there is a lot of interest in this policy and advocacy content. And as a result, we see more and more of that content being used on our main pages. And so, how we kind of ensure the legitimacy of what we are posting, if we do images, for example, we always ensure that it has our Center for Public Policy logo on it, so they know that this is something that we are pushing. We also try to direct back to some sort of link, whether that be Komen's website or a blog or an action alert, something that ties it back to something that is very, very clearly Komen. I think, especially in October, I think all of us see a lot of pink stuff out there, and oftentimes the assumption is that is directly tied to Susan G. Komen because we've been around for so long, and often that is not the case. So making sure that we brand as much as possible is what we have been able to see as successful and has increased our presence online for advocacy specifically.
And, Molly, while I'm on you, we've had a couple of questions come in related to the virtual fly-in. One of which is, do you foresee the virtual fly-ins as being the new go-to for kind of like the traditional versus the traditional in-person event? And also, how did you go about getting these meetings for the virtual event? What information did you send? There's a slew of questions related to the tactical elements too. So if you want to talk a little bit about how you went about executing, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. So on the first question, I don't know, because before 2020, it was very difficult to have video conferences or phone calls with offices because they wanted you to meet in person. And even at the beginning of COVID, there was a slow uptake, I would say, to the virtual setting. I think that offices have become more comfortable with it as it has become the norm. And so I guess we'll see. I don't really trust my crystal ball anymore. So we'll see how it goes. I know, for us as a nonprofit, it's a big investment to have a fly-in in Washington, D.C. And if we can achieve the same or better outcomes in a virtual setting without spending the money and involving more patients and more of our grassroots advocates, it makes sense. And so I hope that it's something that continues, and it might change and evolve. Maybe we do smaller targeted fly-ins when there are situations that you need to be there in person. But I do think there are benefits to the virtual setting. With that said, we built this kind of blind. So we built it as we were doing it. There are companies out there that can help you with the scheduling. We did everything in-house with my nimble small team. So that was an experience. Traditionally when we go to DC, we cast a very large net and send requests out to basically any office that we have a constituent for. We provide dollars or services back into their district. For the virtual setting, and because we were doing this kind of blind, we prioritized key committees, offices that were in leadership, and really dwindled down our list to a much more targeted number of offices. Still a large endeavor, but we, I think, did outreach to about half of the congressional offices. And the way that we did that was, again, similar to what you would do as with an in-person meeting. We emailed the schedulers and said, these are the people that are participating virtually. These are the issues that we want to discuss. And again, we had a pretty good response rate and ended up with a couple hundred meetings. The way logistically that we did that is, fortunately, even before COVID at Komen, all of our team members get a Ring Central platform. And so people that are not on our policy team had the gift of being able to participate in our advocacy summit for the first time ever. And so we really utilized the existing platform that our employees used, and they handled the logistical piece of getting the meetings up and running, and gave us enough platforms to cover all of the meetings happening in one day. But I also know some other groups that have split out their meetings over a week or 2 weeks so it doesn't require all of those same platforms running at the same time. But I do imagine as virtual meetings continue to increase, that there will be more and more services out there to help organizations and companies hold these virtual events.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see the creation of a lot of these events. I've been loving some of these e-gift platforms that you can send. I mean, it's great to see all of these come up. I've seen some hands raised. I know we're about 5 minutes from the hour here. If you don't mind, just for hand raises, put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them. I'll also share some of the additional tactical fly-in questions with Molly and follow up, and I'm sure she'd be able to take a look at them. With kind of the last couple of minutes here, I did want to pose one question to all 4 panelists. I think something that we're always looking to do at FiscalNote is make things actionable. So with that in mind, I'd love for you guys to tell the audience here, what are some actionable tips that you have? That might be quick wins, 1 or 2 things that every public affairs team should be implementing right now. So Alan, I'll start with you, and we'll do the alphabetical loop again.
Yeah, sure. Quick wins will probably be just reiterating some of the things that people have said. I think the the piece that John was talking about on how you look at return on investment. If there is a tip there, it can feel daunting. It can be very difficult. It can be challenging to quantify, but I don't think any of those should stop you making an attempt to understand what is it that we're trying to achieve as outcomes and starting to quantify success against them. So that would be my one tip, is one of the biggest things that's changed our relationship as a public affairs department with our business. So you have to start somewhere. It can be painful, but I would definitely encourage everybody to do that.
And Alan, if you don't mind, telling the audience the name of your book. We just had a question requesting it.
I can do better than that, Chelsea.
Mine's on the other side of the room here. I thought it would be weird if the moderator left.
Sorry, never far from my hands, Chelsea. There we go.
There you go. Thank you. So John, in terms of kind of your tactical advice.
Yeah, I would say for internal stakeholders, I encourage you to house the data that you collect on government actions, on trends, etc., in a way that your entire organization has access to. And I also would encourage everybody to set up sort of a weekly internal update that you send as to what these are and what they mean to the business. I think internal communication in times where we're not in crisis, just showing that listening to this type of information is really important and business critical is one of the things that everybody can do. I especially think warehousing information and making sure you have access to it very quickly is the kind of institutional memory that is required for a very agile government affairs team. So I think that these are really practical things that can be done very easily. And also they would enable us to then have what we need when we have to respond externally effectively, because all of that information is at our fingertips.
Marcel. Thanks, John.
Yeah, John, I so much agree with what you just said. I would say, develop that relationship with your critical internal stakeholders and make sure that you have clear priorities, and more important even, that you have very clear objectives that they want you to work on. In this time and age of information overload, it's very important to keep yourself a little bit sane and make sure that you know what the priorities and the objectives are.
So I also would echo what John shared. I think additionally, one piece that hasn't been mentioned that I'd push for, and take advantage of the virtual setting that we're in now, and the opportunity to engage more people. I think we have two things going for us in the advocacy space. One, we can engage a lot more people virtually, and so embrace it right now. But also there's a huge interest right now on the impact government legislation, regulations can have on people. And so really taking advantage of that and getting as many people engaged right now as you can.
Thank you. Well, listen, I know we're right on the hour here, so I want to thank everyone for joining today. Alan, Molly, John, Marcel, thank you so much for participating. I know that time is a valuable resource, especially when you're living at work, so to speak. So an hour of your day does not go unnoticed. So we'll send out a follow-up email shortly with a link to today's webinar. I've had a lot of requests to include any links to publications that our panelists might have. So I'll be sure to follow up with that information as well. Just because I don't think I'm going to have another platform like this to say it and before November 3rd. I hope everyone goes out and votes. I know you will, because you guys work in the space. But thanks again for joining, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.